Chapter 6 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 3. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 3 by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 6, The Cabinet Regime. The ultimatum presented by the commissioners was at once made the subject of a cabinet discussion, continued in the evening of the same day. No decision was arrived at, and the meetings would be without special interest, were it not for the report of one of the incidents that shows the feeling which divided the members into two irreconcilable factions. The scene is given in the language of one of the participants in the evening session of Friday, December 28th, who afterwards recounted the event in the council room of the White House. Secretary Stanton said, "The last I saw of Floyd was in this room, lying on the sofa which then stood between the windows yonder. I remember it well. It was on the night of the 28th of December, 1860. We had had high words and had almost come to blows in our discussion over Fort Sumter. Thompson was here. Thompson was a plausible talker, and as a last resort, having been driven from every other argument, advocated the evacuation of the fort on the plea of generosity. South Carolina, he said, was but a small state with a sparse white population. We were a great and powerful people in a strong, vigorous government. We could afford to say to South Carolina, 'See, we will withdraw our garrison as an evidence that we mean you no harm.' Stanton replied to him, 'Mr. President, the proposal to be generous implies that the government is strong, and that we, as the public servants, have the confidence of the people. I think that is a mistake. No administration has ever suffered the loss of public confidence and support as this has done. Only the other day it was announced that $1 million had been stolen from Mr. Thompson's department. The bonds were found to have been taken from the vault where they should have been kept, and the notes of Mr. Floyd were substituted for them. Now it is proposed to give up Sumter. All I have to say is that no administration, much less this one, can afford to lose $1 million of money and a fort in the same week.' Floyd remained silent and did not reappear in that chamber." The Cabinet was again convened on the evening of Saturday, December the 29th, but when it met, there was one vacant seat at the council board. During that day, Floyd sent in his formal resignation, complaining that he had been subjected to a violation of solemn pledges and plighted faith. The resignation was accepted on the following Monday, and the War Department placed provisionally under the charge of Postmaster General Holt. To the 6 assembled councilors, Mr. Buchanan now submitted the draft of his reply to the commissioners. The precise terms and substance of this document remained unpublished, and we are compelled to gather its import from a rather elaborate written criticism of it by a member of the Cabinet. This indicates, however, with sufficient clearness that the paper, like all Mr. Buchanan's writings and conversations of that period, was contradictory, loose in expression, and entirely lacking in any clear presentation of issues or a straightforward decision of pending questions. A half defense and half apology, seeking simply to evade and shift just official responsibility. Of all the Cabinet members, Mr. Toucey alone approved the reply. Thompson and Thomas, with active sympathies in behalf of secession, assailed it as being hostile to South Carolina and calculated to provoke a conflict, while Black, Stanton, and Holt insisted that it ignobly yielded the rights and honor of the government to the rebellion which had assailed its flag and property. To all appearance unmoved by these searching and acrimonious discussions, the President seemed to adhere inflexibly both to the form and substance of the reply he had sketched, and the conference ended with every indication of a new and this time radical Cabinet crisis. It is not probable that either the Chief Magistrate or any or all of his constitutional advisers comprehended the novel relations and changing aspects of national politics. The heat of their daily strife warped their judgment, and the rancor of their discords obscured their vision too much for correct analysis. Upon a more remote and dispassionate study of these men, it comes out that President Buchanan's was a cold, secretive, rigid, unsympathetic character, in which the two opposing qualities of stubbornness and timidity met and neutralized each other, leaving a colorless personality peculiarly subject to be moved by political drifts which he lacked the insight to perceive and the courage to resist. Two opposing currents in the Cabinet, one towards active disunion, represented by Cobb, Thompson, and Floyd, and recently Thomas, and the others towards a conservative unionism, represented by Cass, Black, Holt, and recently Stanton, had kept the President in an eddy, with his darling political paradoxes about secession and coercion, enforcement and violence, executive duty and congressional power, revolution and compromise forever on his lips, and the ghastly and overwhelming phantom of civil war forever before his eyes. The end of December, therefore, when he was called upon to decide the fate of Anderson and Sumter, found him no further advanced than when, at the beginning of the month, he was writing his message. All the great political events which had happened, the significant congressional debates, his truce with rebellion, the rupture of his cabinet, proclamation of the insurrection, South Carolina secession, Anderson's movement, the Charleston seizures, and the actual presence of the insurrection in the Executive Mansion in the persons of the three commissioners, had swept by him, not indeed unnoted, but utterly uncomprehended. Though seized by friend and foe alike and dragged time and again into the broad light of his state duties and responsibilities, he as constantly shrank back into the obscurity of his personal fears, refusing to exercise his executive functions. The wide drift in politics, however, now sweeping unresisted and with a rising current, not only in South Carolina, but in other cotton states as well, from discontent to conspiracy and from conspiracy to insurrection, while it left the President stationary in attitude and resolve, had quite a different effect upon the members of his Cabinet. We have already seen how it drew out Cobb to personal service in rebellion, and drove out Cass as a protest against executive indifference and neglect. The same influence had now forced out Floyd, much against the inclination of that double-dealing politician. Nor did the influence end here. Though the king be dead, the king must live. A nation of 30 millions is a daily force with daily needs, and if the President refuses office, the next in authority must take up the task. With all Buchanan's protests that it was not his work, the national questions grew daily in magnitude and portent. On the 26th, it was the query of receiving the commissioners. On the 27th, the question of remanding Anderson to Moultrie. On the 28th, the demand to withdraw the garrison altogether. In a week, it might be civil war, and in a month, an army at the gates of the Capitol. Though the President might shirk the pressing issues, South Carolina and the Union assuredly would not. From the presidential election to the evacuation of Moultrie, Mr. Buchanan's policy had been, in substance, an effort to abstain as far as possible from affairs of state, and his written reply to the commissioners was a simple continuation of that policy. But this was now approved by only one member of his cabinet, the other five condemning it, though from motives radically unlike. Thompson and Thomas, importuned by their friends, could no longer postpone decisive action to favor the conspiracy, while Black, Holt, and Stanton dared no longer defer energetic efforts to maintain the government. With the adjournment of that cabinet meeting on Saturday night, December the 29th, therefore, it is scarcely too strong to say, terminated the real administration of James Buchanan and began what may be appropriately called the regime of the cabinet. It is true that he still continued to affix his official signature and draw his official salary, but the most that can be claimed for his rulership is that he performed the function defined by the French historian Thiers in his famous constitutional maxim of European monarchies: the king reigns, he does not govern. We look in vain through the remainder of Mr. Buchanan's term for positive, affirmative executive acts. He simply assents to or refuses what is proposed by his ministers, and every strong manifestation of national authority seems to have been one which they did not permit him to prevent. The temper of his mind and purpose is accurately outlined in his own language in a special message which he transmitted to Congress on the 8th of January, and which was in its entirety little else than a lamentation over the woes and dangers of the country, and a despairing cry exhorting Congress to call upon the people to preserve the Union, apparently forgetting that that was the precise duty for which the people had elected him President, and which duty he had specifically sworn to perform. The dangerous and hostile attitude of the states towards each other has already far transcended and cast in the shade the ordinary executive duties already provided for by law, and has assumed such vast and alarming proportions as to place the subject entirely above and beyond executive control. The fact cannot be disguised that we are in the midst of a great revolution. In all its various bearings, therefore, I commend the question to Congress as the only human tribunal under Providence possessing the power to meet the existing emergency. To them exclusively belongs the power to declare war or to authorize the employment of military force in all cases contemplated by the Constitution, and they alone possess the power to remove grievances which might lead to war and to secure peace and union to this distracted country. On them and on them alone rests the responsibility. I therefore appeal through you to the people of the country to declare in their might that the Union must and shall be preserved by all constitutional means. In conclusion, it may be permitted to me to remark that I have often warned my countrymen of the dangers which now surround us. This may be the last time I shall refer to this subject officially. This is no longer the potential voice of a President of the United States administering government, but the cry of a bewildered functionary who has lost command, confidence, courage, and is even almost deserted by hope. Most radical of all the changes effected by these developments was that wrought in Jeremiah S. Black, Secretary of State. No one can read his famous opinion on coercion given to sustain the President's annual message without realizing the profound influence under which the conspirators controlled his legal reasoning and his official utterance at the date of November 20, 1860. But on the retirement of Mr. Cass, his elevation to the Secretaryship of State appears to have given him wider and truer views. Growing with his increasing national responsibilities, he now in the Sumter crisis seems to have risen to genuine leadership. On Sunday morning, December 30, convinced of the President's intention to adhere to his submitted reply to the commissioners, Mr. Black convened the Union section of the Cabinet. His inability to sustain further the President's contemplated action declared his intention to resign, in which resolve he was also joined by Mr. Stanton. After due discussion and reflection, Mr. Toucey carried the information of this threatened defection to the President. Mr. Buchanan's courage utterly broke down before the prospect of finding himself alone in face of the political complications which came crowding upon him. He at once sent for Mr. Black, and after a confidential interview, the details of which have never been revealed, he gave the objectionable draft of his reply to the Secretary of State, with liberty to make all changes and amendments which in his opinion might be necessary. It was the President's virtual abdication. Mr. Black hurried to the office of the Attorney General, and there, in the presence of Mr. Stanton, and doubtless with his advice and suggestion, wrote out a detailed and methodical memorandum covering the points at variance. It is a strong and patriotic paper, and had it been adopted by the Executive as the keynote of his annual message and enforced promptly by the Army and Navy, the rebellion might never have reached its final proportions. It not only deprecated any expression of regret that the commissioners should suspend negotiations, but roundly denied the right of South Carolina to send any such officials or agents. It stated that the Charleston forts belonged to the government and could not be made the subject of any adjustment or arrangement, but must be maintained by the power of the nation. On the subject of the President's pledge, it asserted with vigor that it deeply concerns the President's reputation that he should contradict this statement, since, if it be undenied, it puts him in the attitude of an executive officer who voluntarily disarms himself of the power to perform his duty and ties up his hands so that he cannot, without breaking his word, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution and see the laws faithfully executed. The definition of coercion contained in this memorandum, when compared with the same writer's employment of the word in his famous opinion of November 20, 1860, is a burst of patriotic sunlight. The words coercing a state by force of arms to remain in the Confederacy, a power which I do not believe the Constitution has conferred on Congress, ought certainly not to be retained. They are too vague and might have the effect, which I am sure the President does not intend, to mislead the Commissioners concerning his sentiments. The power to defend the public property, to resist an assailing force which unlawfully attempts to drive out the troops of the United States from one of the fortifications, and to use the military and naval forces for the purpose of aiding the proper officers of the United States in the execution of the laws. This, as far as it goes, is coercion, and may very well be called coercing a state by force of arms to remain in the Union. Contrasting the language of Mr. Black, Secretary of State, endorsed and sustained by a mutinous Cabinet majority, with the words of Mr. Black, Attorney General, acquiesced in by the tolerant Cabinet majority of 6 weeks previous, we are able to measure accurately the immense change in the theory and purpose of the administration, which was now intended to be announced. But the reform did not stop even here. From a hearty and outspoken eulogy of Anderson, the memorandum proceeded to a vigorous recommendation of defensive measures. He has saved the country, I solemnly believe, when its day was darkest and its perils most extreme. He has done everything that mortal man could do to repair the fatal error which the administration have committed in not sending down troops enough to hold all the forts. He has kept the strongest one. He still commands the harbor. We may still execute the laws if we try. I entreat the President to order the Brooklyn and the Macedonian to Charleston without the least delay. And in the meantime, send a trusty messenger to Major Anderson to let him know that his government will not desert him. The reinforcement of troops from New York or Old Point Comfort should follow immediately. If this be done, all may yet be not well, but comparatively safe. If not, I can see nothing before us but disaster and ruin to the country. Sheet by sheet, as rapidly as Mr. Black wrote this long memorandum, Mr. Stanton made a copy of it, and the original was sent to the President. Mr. Holt saw it later in the day and also gave it his unqualified approval. Mr. Buchanan amended his reply, embodying in it many parts of this document, but with a lingering pride of opinion, or perhaps deference to the haughty assumptions of the commissioners, he chose and used only the mildest and weakest phrases. Despite traceable infusion from Mr. Black's memorandum, his letter remained an humble apologetic argument, and not a manly and confident assertion of right, duty, and power. It still reiterated his purely defensive instructions, his anxiety to refer their propositions to Congress, his first prompting to remand Anderson to Moultrie, his deep regret that they deemed negotiations impossible. Yet it at least mentioned the insurrectionary seizure of forts and arsenal. It promised that Anderson should not be condemned without a fair hearing, that he would not withdraw the troops, and that it was his duty to defend Fort Sumter as a portion of the public property of the United States against hostile attacks from whatever quarter they may come. By these narrow distinctions, the President of the United States escaped the impending disgrace of lowering the flag of the Union with not a hostile soldier in arms before it. When the commissioners on Monday, the last day of December, received this reply of the Cabinet over the signature of the President, they saw that their mission was ended, and yet they were without results, without promises, without prospects. They had rejected the proffered negotiations with Congress and sacrificed their visiting relations with the President. Worse than all, the letter indicated the advent of a new authority which had the courage to say no. It was the first fresh breeze of a northern reaction which might rise to a storm. Under the circumstances, there was nothing to do but to pocket their credentials and go home. To this they added the only other expedient the situation permitted, a bitter and insulting rejoinder to fire the Southern heart. Upon this second letter to the President, they apparently expended their united skill and emptied their accumulated indignation. They drew up a sententious arraignment of his official neglected duty. They charged distinctly that in his interview with them his words had indicated a willingness to withdraw the troops and deliver them the forts in the harbor. Their allegations were only partly true, for the dissembling Floyd was responsible for the Buell memorandum and the surrender instructions. They evidently thought Mr. Buchanan capable of treason, when his offense was personal timidity and consequent neglect of duty. As a succinct summary of events, no less than as the analysis of their complete web of intrigue and outline of expected successes, the following portion merits quotation. Some weeks ago, the state of South Carolina declared her intention in the existing condition of public affairs to secede from the United States. She called the convention of her people to put her declaration in force. The convention met and passed the ordinance of secession. All this you anticipated, and your course of action was thoroughly considered. In your annual message, you declared you had no right and would not attempt to coerce a seceding state, but that you were bound by your constitutional oath and would defend the property of the United States within the borders of South Carolina if an attempt was made to take it by force. Seeing very early that this question of property was a difficult and delicate one, you manifested a desire to settle it without collision. You did not reinforce the garrison in the harbor of Charleston. You removed a distinguished and veteran officer from the command of Fort Moultrie because he attempted to increase his supply of ammunition. You refused to send additional troops to the same garrison when applied for by the officer appointed to succeed him. You accepted the resignation of the oldest and most eminent member of your cabinet rather than allow the garrison to be strengthened. You compelled an officer stationed at Fort Sumter to return immediately to the arsenal 40 muskets which he had taken to arm his men. You expressed not to one, but to many of the most distinguished of our public characters, whose testimony will be placed upon the record whenever it is necessary, your anxiety for a peaceful termination of this controversy, and your willingness not to disturb the military status of the forts if commissioners should be sent to the government, whose communications you promised to submit to Congress. You received and acted on assurances from the highest official authorities of South Carolina that no attempt would be made to disturb your possession of the forts and property of the United States if you would not disturb their existing condition until the commissioners had been sent and the attempt to negotiate had failed. You took from the members of the House of Representatives a written memorandum that no such attempt should be made. You sent orders to your officers commanding them strictly to follow a line of conduct in conformity with such an understanding. You knew the implied condition under which we came. Our arrival was notified to you and an hour appointed for an interview. With the facts we have stated, and in face of the crowning and conclusive fact that your Secretary of War had resigned his seat in the Cabinet upon the publicly avowed ground that the action of Major Anderson had violated the pledged faith of the government, and that unless the pledge was instantly redeemed he was dishonored, denial was impossible. You did not deny it. You do not deny it now, but you seek to escape from its obligation. You have decided, you have resolved to hold by force what you have obtained through our misplaced confidence, and by refusing to disavow the action of Major Anderson, have converted his violation of orders into a legitimate act of your executive authority. This humiliating reminder of the commissioners sent to the President as a Parthian arrow while they sped by rail back to Charleston to report their discomfiture, too accurate in many points, both in statement and logic, to be completely refuted, and too offensive in language and intent to be either answered or tolerated, Mr. Buchanan took his only alternative by writing upon it the endorsement, "This paper just presented to the President is of such a character that he declines to receive it," and returning it to the signers. The central cabal, however, was unwilling to lose the effect of the forcible indictment on public opinion, and Jefferson Davis seized an early occasion to incorporate the commissioner's rejoinder at full length in a Senate speech, thus giving it ample circulation in print in the Congressional Globe and the newspaper reports of Senate proceedings. End of chapter 6.